The crowd gathered early, filling the hall with lively conversations and a warm sense of celebration. Richard was the man of the hour, surrounded by people who admired his dedication and success. His career had spanned decades, earning him respect and friendships that showed in every handshake and heartfelt word shared that evening. Margaret, his wife, was by his side, greeting guests with a calm demeanor and steady smile. To most, she looked like the picture of pride and support, a perfect partner for a man who had achieved so much. The evening was meant to honor Richard's accomplishments, a highlight reel of his life playing out through stories, laughter, and clinking glasses. Yet, Margaret knew that while everyone celebrated Richard's public image, the truth behind the scenes was a much different story. As the evening went on, guests took turns sharing stories about Richard, painting a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to his work and his family. Laughter echoed through the hall as old colleagues shared lighthearted memories, while close friends spoke about his unwavering commitment. Each word seemed to add another layer to the perfect image of Richard, a man who appeared to have it all. Margaret stood silently, her expression calm as she listened. On the surface, she appeared just as proud as everyone else, but each compliment and joke about Richard's long hours at work stirred something deeper within her. The admiration from the crowd only reminded her of the sacrifices she had made to stand beside him, sacrifices that no one else in the room seemed to notice. This wasn't just a celebration for Richard, it was also a mirror reflecting the life she had endured. Margaret stood quietly, watching as Richard's colleagues and friends shared their speeches, one after another. Each story praised his hard work, his loyalty to the company, and his ability to connect with everyone around him. Smiles and applause filled the room, reinforcing the image of a man who had given everything to his career. But as the stories went on, small details began to sting. Mentions of long nights at the office, last-minute business trips, and the ever-present support of his secretary, Caroline, brought back memories Margaret had tried to suppress. The laughter that followed each anecdote felt hollow to her, a reminder of the many nights she had spent alone, wondering what was truly happening. Margaret clenched her wineglass a little tighter, her polite smile starting to waver. The life everyone in the room admired wasn't the full story, and she knew it all too well. As the night unfolded, Margaret found herself drifting into her own thoughts. The speeches continued, each one filled with admiration for Richard's dedication and achievements. But to Margaret, they were a painful reminder of how much had been overlooked. The guests saw him as a man of integrity and loyalty, but she knew better. For years, she had pieced together a side of Richard no one else seemed to notice. It started small late-night calls, unexplained expenses, and vague excuses. Over time, the pattern became clear, and Margaret could no longer dismiss the signs. Tonight, as she stood in the middle of this celebration, surrounded by people who adored Richard, she realized how alone she had been in carrying the weight of his betrayals. Every word of praise from the crowd felt like a sharp jab, pushing her closer to the moment when she could no longer stay silent. Margaret's mind was racing as she stood among the crowd, their laughter and chatter a distant hum in her ears. She had spent years carefully hiding her pain, keeping up the image of a devoted wife for the sake of appearances. While everyone else saw Richard as a pillar of success and stability, Margaret had lived with the cracks in the foundation, the lies, the distance, and the unspoken truths that haunted their marriage. She had spent countless nights convincing herself to endure it, to push the doubts aside for the sake of family and reputation. But tonight was different. The weight of pretending felt heavier than ever, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of breaking her silence. The room may have been filled with Richard's admirers, but Margaret knew the truth had been waiting in the shadows far too long. As the evening reached its peak, the crowd gathered closer, hanging on every word as Richard prepared to take the stage. He smiled confidently, ready to deliver his thank you speech, the culmination of a night devoted to celebrating his career. Margaret stood nearby, her expression steady, but her thoughts racing. For years, she had watched Richard thrive in the spotlight, admired for his charm and accomplishments. but she also knew how much of his life had been built on carefully constructed lies. As he stepped forward to address the room, Margaret felt a surge of clarity. She had stayed quiet for so long, letting the world see only the version of Richard he wanted them to believe. But now, with all eyes on him, she felt it was time for the truth to be seen. Tonight wasn't just Richard's moment, it was hers too. Margaret's heart was steady as she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the buzz of the crowd. All eyes turned to her, surprised by the interruption. She had always been the quiet supporter, standing in Richard's shadow, never taking the spotlight. But tonight, she felt a strength she hadn't known in years. As Richard hesitated, caught off guard, Margaret's calm tone filled the room. She spoke with purpose, her words carrying the weight of years of silence. The crowd, moments ago full of laughter and admiration, now stood in stunned silence, their attention fully on her. Margaret knew this was her chance to finally share what she had kept buried, and she was determined to make every word count. The room grew quieter as Margaret's words began to sink in. She spoke with clarity and precision, laying bare truths she had carried alone for years. Her voice didn't waver as she described the moments of doubt, the signs she could no longer ignore, and the betrayal she had pieced together. The crowd, once celebrating Richard, now listened intently, their expressions shifting from confusion to unease. Margaret wasn't angry or emotional, she was calm, her tone deliberate, as if each word had been rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. Richard stood frozen, his confident smile fading as the image he had worked so hard to maintain began to crumble in front of everyone who once admired him. The weight of her truth had changed the atmosphere entirely. Margaret didn't look away from Richard as she continued. Her words were measured but powerful, peeling back the layers of the life he had so carefully constructed. She spoke about trust, loyalty, and the sacrifices she had made for their marriage, sacrifices she now realized had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their earlier joy replaced with uncertainty. Whispers began to ripple through the room as guests exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Margaret's voice, however, remained steady. She had spent years enduring this silently, but tonight she was reclaiming her voice. Each statement landed with a sharp finality, leaving no room for doubt about the truth she was exposing. For the first time, Richard was no longer the center of admiration Margaret was. Margaret's revelations grew sharper, cutting through the pretense that had surrounded Richard for years. She didn't just stop at the affair, she revealed the lies that had intertwined their personal and professional lives. Every late night, every unexplained absence, and every vague excuse now painted a clear picture for the stunned crowd. Richard tried to maintain his composure, but the cracks in his demeanor were obvious. His usual confidence faltered as he glanced at the faces around him, friends, colleagues, even family now filled with doubt and unease. Margaret had no intention of sparing him the discomfort. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was seeking closure. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about truth, and the truth was impossible to ignore any longer. As Margaret's words continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. What had started as a celebration was now heavy with tension. The guests, who had once laughed and cheered for Richard, now avoided his gaze. Each revelation seemed to strip away another layer of the polished image he had so carefully built. Margaret didn't raise her voice, nor did she rush her words. Instead, she allowed the weight of her story to speak for itself. She described the evidence she had uncovered, small pieces at first, growing into an undeniable truth. The silence in the room was deafening, the gravity of her words sinking in. Richard stood motionless, the realization that his double life was unraveling in front of everyone he valued etched on his face. For Margaret, this was no longer about him, it was about her finally taking back control of her narrative. Margaret paused, letting her words settle over the room. She turned her gaze to the crowd, meeting their stunned expressions. Her voice softened, but the strength in it remained. She spoke about the years she had spent questioning herself, doubting her instincts, and pretending everything was fine for the sake of appearances. She described how lonely it felt to carry the weight of Richard's betrayals in silence, putting on a brave face for the world while privately struggling with the truth. The guests, many of whom had admired Richard for years, now looked at Margaret with a newfound respect. Her vulnerability and honesty were undeniable, and her courage to speak out in front of everyone was something no one could ignore. The room was no longer about Richard, it had become Margaret's moment. Margaret's voice grew steadier as she continued, shifting from recounting past betrayals to explaining why she had chosen this moment to speak. For years, she had stayed silent, convincing herself it was for the greater good for their family, for their reputation, for the life they had built. But silence, she explained, had come at a cost. She spoke of the toll it had taken on her, how each lie she ignored and each truth she buried had slowly eroded her sense of self. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was laying out the reality of what it meant to live in someone else's shadow while carrying their secrets. The crowd was transfixed, their earlier unease now mixed with admiration for her strength. Margaret was no longer just a supporting character in Richard's story. She was reclaiming her own. Margaret took a deep breath before addressing the room once more. Her focus shifted from recounting the past to the lessons she had learned through her experience. She spoke plainly about the danger of appearances, the way a polished image can hide deep cracks beneath the surface. It wasn't just about Richard's betrayal, it was about the lies people tell themselves to keep up the illusion of a perfect life. She admitted how hard it had been to finally confront the truth and how much strength it had taken to step forward. Margaret wasn't just telling her story. She was offering a moment of reflection for everyone in the room. Her words weren't filled with anger, they were filled with a quiet resolve, the kind that only comes after years of holding back. The hall that had once celebrated Richard now stood in silence, captivated by Margaret's courage and clarity. Margaret's final words were not about Richard's actions, but about her own transformation. She explained how, over time, she realized that staying silent wasn't strength, it was fear. Fear of change, fear of judgment, and fear of facing an uncertain future. But tonight, she had decided that her fear would no longer define her. She spoke about finding her voice, reclaiming her identity, and choosing to live a life grounded in honesty and self-respect. The room, once filled with celebration, now felt heavy with reflection. Guests who had arrived to honor Richard were now seeing Margaret in an entirely new light. As she stepped back, her presence filled the room not with triumph, but with a quiet dignity that left an indelible impression on everyone present. This wasn't just her reckoning, it was her beginning.